They say success is the best revenge, but Catherine didn't just want success. She wanted absolute, crushing justice. Picture this. One night, you are the queen of Manhattan society, hosting galas for senators and CEOs. The next morning, you are on the street with two suitcases and a frozen bank account discarded by the man you helped build. Richard thought he was untouchable. He thought Catherine was weak. He was wrong. It took 10 years, a hidden identity, and a ruthless, hostile takeover. But when Catherine finally walked back into Richard's office, she wasn't there to ask for alimony. She was there to sign his termination papers. This is the story of how the woman he kicked out with nothing returned to buy the very company that fired him. The air inside the penthouse, at 432 Park Avenue, was usually perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of sandalwood and expensive lilies. But on that Tuesday evening in November, it felt suffocatingly cold. Catherine Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering grid of Manhattan. At 42, she was still striking sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of steel, and a posture that betrayed none of the panic fluttering in her chest. She had spent the last 15 years being the perfect wife to Richard Sterling, the CEO of Vanguard Global, a logistics and shipping conglomerate that moved half the world's consumer goods. She heard the heavy oak door creak open behind her. She didn't turn around. "You're home early," she said, her voice steady. Richard didn't answer immediately. The sound of his footsteps on the Italian marble floor was heavy, rhythmic, and strangely final. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a double scotch, Macallan, 25, the bottle she had bought him for their anniversary, and took a long sip. "We need to talk, Catherine," Richard said. His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was indifferent. It was the voice he used when he was laying off 1,000 factory workers in Ohio to boost the Q3 stock price. Catherine finally turned. Richard was a handsome man in that distinct, polished Wall Street way, silver fox hair, a bespoke Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars, and eyes that had long ago lost their warmth. "Talk about what, Richard? The fact that you've been staying late at the office for 3 months? Or should we talk about the charges on the Amex for the Ritz in Paris?" Richard sighed, placing the glass down with a sharp clink. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It slid across the surface, stopping inches from her legs. "I'm filing for divorce, Catherine. The papers are already drawn up. My lawyers, Sullivan and Cromwell, have been working on this for 6 months. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face, but she didn't flinch. 6 months? We were in the Hamptons last month. You toasted to our future. That was for the shareholders, Richard said, checking his Rolex. Look, let's not make this messy. The prenup is ironclad. You get the lump sum we agreed upon 15 years ago. It's not much by today's standards, but it's enough to set you up in a nice condo in Jersey, perhaps. The prenup? Catherine laughed, a dry, brittle sound. I signed that when you were a junior analyst with a negative net worth. I helped you build Vanguard. I edited every speech. I charmed every investor. I hosted every dinner that got you the Asian expansion deal. I built this life, Richard. You were a supportive spouse, Richard corrected coldly. But let's be honest, Catherine. You've aged. You're tired. And the company needs a fresh image. I need a partner who reflects where Vanguard is going, not where it's been. The elevator doors pinged open, directly into the penthouse. A woman stepped out. She couldn't have been more than 24. She was blonde, leggy, and wearing a coat that Catherine realized, with a sick lurch of her stomach, was hers. It was the vintage mink Catherine had put in storage for the winter. "Isabella," Richard said, his voice suddenly dripping with honey. "I told you to wait in the lobby." "It was cold, Richard," Isabella said, pouting. She looked at Catherine, not with sympathy, but with the curiosity of someone looking at a piece of furniture that was about to be thrown out. Catherine looked from the girl to her husband. "You're bringing her here? Now?" "She's moving in, Catherine," Richard said. He gestured to the door. "Tonight, you can't do this. I have rights. I have." "You have nothing," Richard snapped. the mask of civility finally slipping. "I've already canceled your credit cards. The joint accounts have been drained and moved to offshore trusts you can't touch. The security team is on their way up to escort you out. You can take 2 suitcases. Anything else stays." "You're kicking me out? In the middle of the night?" "It's 8 p.m., Catherine. The hotels are open." Catherine stared at him. The man she had nursed through a heart scare 3 years ago. The man whose hand she held when his father died. He was looking at her like she was a line item on a budget sheet that needed to be redacted. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The shock was so profound it acted like an anesthetic. She walked to the bedroom, pulled out 2 Tumi suitcases, and packed with robotic efficiency. She took her clothes, her mother's jewelry, and a small, leather-bound notebook from her nightstand. When she walked back into the living room, 2 burly security guards, men she had greeted by name for years, were waiting. They wouldn't look her in the eye. "Escort Miss Miller out," Richard said, already using her maiden name. He was pouring a drink for Isabella. Catherine paused at the door. The wind from the elevator shaft hit her. She looked back one last time. "You think you're invincible, Richard," she said quietly. "But you forgot one thing. Vanguard isn't just numbers, it's people. And you just made an enemy of the one person who knows where all the bodies are buried." Richard laughed. "Goodbye, Catherine. Don't forget to leave your key card." The elevator doors closed, sealing her out of her life. 10 minutes later, Catherine stood on the sidewalk of Park Avenue. It had started to rain. She hailed a cab, but when she tried to pay with her black card, the driver shook his head. Declined. "Lady," she tried another card. Declined. She checked her bank app on her phone. Access denied. Richard hadn't just divorced her. He had erased her. She had $40 in cash in her purse and nowhere to go. The descent was fast and brutal. Catherine spent the first week in a flea-bitten motel in Queens, paying cash she got by pawning her diamond earrings. The jeweler, a greasy man on 47th Street, knew she was desperate and gave her 30 cents on the dollar. She took it. She had to eat. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She was 42, with a gap in her resume spanning 15 years. To the world, she was a socialite, a housewife. No headhunter in Manhattan would touch her. They all knew Richard. Vanguard Global was too powerful, and Richard had likely blacklisted her. Every interview ended the same way. "We appreciate your interest, Mrs. Sterling, but we're looking for someone with more recent operational experience. Or worse, aren't you Richard Sterling's wife? I don't think it would be appropriate for us to hire you, given the conflict of interest." By month 3, the pawn money was running out. Catherine moved into a basement apartment in Bushwick. It smelled of mildew and boiled cabbage. The heating pipes clanged all night, sounding like prison bars slamming shut. She sat on a mattress she'd bought at a thrift store, staring at the leather-bound notebook she had saved. It wasn't a diary. It was her shadow ledger. For years, Catherine had sat in on Richard's dinner meetings. She had listened as he bragged about skirting EPA regulations or how he leveraged debt to buy out competitors. She had notes on every major deal Vanguard had made in the last decade. She knew the company's logistics software, Vector, was outdated and prone to crashing a secret. Richard spent millions covering up. "I don't need a job," she whispered to the empty, damp room. "I need a weapon." The next day, she stopped applying for executive roles. She dyed her signature blonde hair, a deep, nondescript chestnut brown, and put on a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. She went by her middle name, Ann Miller. She applied for a job at Nexus, a scrappy, struggling logistics startup based in a converted warehouse in the Navy Yard. Nexus was trying to use artificial intelligence to optimize shipping routes, direct competition to Vanguard. But they were tiny, barely a blip on Richard's radar. The CEO of Nexus was a brilliant but chaotic 20-something named Arthur Pendleton. He interviewed her while eating a bagel, wearing a hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. "Look, Anne," Arthur said, looking at her resume, which she had creatively reformatted to downplay her wealth and highlight her organizational skills. "We can't pay much. You'd be an office manager / executive assistant. Coffee? Scheduling? keeping the lights on. We're burning cash fast. I don't care about the money, Catherine said, and she meant it. I see potential in what you're doing. Vanguard is a dinosaur. Their routing algorithms are based on 1990s logic. If you can integrate real-time weather and geopolitical data into your AI, you can beat them on speed by 15%. Arthur stopped chewing. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. How do you know about Vanguard's algorithms? I read a lot, she lied smoothly. I can organize your office, Arthur, but I can also help you strategize. Let me handle the operations. You focus on the code. Arthur hesitated, then shrugged. You're hired. Start now. The coffee machine is broken. Catherine smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in 4 months. While Catherine was unclogging a coffee machine in Brooklyn, Richard was on the cover of Forbes. The headline read, "The King of Commerce. Richard Sterling on love, life, and logistics." The article featured a photo of Richard and Isabella on a yacht in the Mediterranean. Isabella was wearing a diamond necklace that Catherine recognized. Richard had bought it for Catherine's 40th birthday, but claimed he had lost it. Catherine pinned the magazine cover to the peeling paint of her basement wall. "Enjoy the yacht, Richard," she muttered, wiping grease from her hands. "Because the storm is coming." Over the next 2 years, Catherine transformed Nexus. She was the first one in and the last one out. She imposed discipline on the chaotic startup. She used her knowledge of Vanguard's weaknesses to guide Arthur's development team. Vanguard was sluggish. Nexus became agile. Vanguard locked clients into long contracts. Nexus offered flexibility, but Catherine knew that to truly hurt Richard, they needed capital. Serious capital. And she knew exactly who to ask. There was one man Richard feared more than anyone, Jonathan Price. Price was an old-school corporate raider, a billionaire investor known as the Butcher of Wall Street. Richard had screwed Price over on a deal in 2018, costing Price $50 million. Price never forgave, and he never forgot. Catherine took a sick day from Nexus. She put on her one remaining good suit, a black Chanel number she had saved in plastic. She walked into the headquarters of Price Capital, not as Ann Miller, the office manager, but as Catherine Sterling. The receptionist tried to dismiss her. "Mr. Price doesn't take unsolicited meetings." "Tell him," Catherine said, her voice dropping to that icy tone she had mastered, "that I have the source code to Vanguard's failure. And tell him I'm Richard Sterling's ex-wife." 2 minutes later, she was ushered into the corner office. Jonathan Price was a small man, with eyes like shards of flint. He sat behind a desk the size of an aircraft carrier. "Mrs. Sterling," Price said, not standing up, "I heard you were living in a box. Richard tells everyone you had a mental breakdown." "Richard tells people a lot of things," Catherine said, sitting down uninvited. "I'm not here for charity, Jonathan. I'm here to make you $1 billion. Price leaned forward. "I'm listening. I work for a company called Nexus. We have the tech to wipe Vanguard off the map, but we need scaling capital. Richard is over-leveraged. He bought 3 shipping lines last year at peak market prices. His debt is ballooning. If Nexus starts stealing his major accounts, his stock will wobble. If his stock wobbles, his debt covenants trigger." She paused for effect. "And when his debt triggers, Vanguard will be vulnerable to a hostile takeover. You can buy him out for pennies on the dollar." Price stared at her for a long, silent minute. Then, a slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. "You want me to fund a competitor just to lower his stock price so I can buy his company?" "I want you to fund us," Catherine corrected. "And when you buy Vanguard, I want one thing in the contract." "And what is that?" "I want to be the one who fires him." Price chuckled. It was a dry, rasping sound. "You're wicked, Catherine. I like it. How much does Nexus need?" $20 million. Series A. Price pulled out a checkbook. "Done." Catherine walked out of the building with a check for $20 million in her purse. She pulled out her phone and called Arthur. "Arthur," she said, "order pizza. We're working late. We just got funded." Back in his penthouse, Richard was arguing with Isabella. She wanted a new villa in Tuscany. He was trying to explain that cash flow was a bit tight this quarter. He had no idea that 20 blocks away, the fuse had just been lit on a bomb that would destroy his entire world. Success in New York City is usually loud. It's champagne popping, engines revving, and headlines screaming. But the rise of Nexus was quiet. It was a predator moving through tall grass. With Jonathan Price's $20 million, Catherine didn't buy fancy furniture or penthouse offices. She hired engineers. She poached the best data scientists from Google and angry operations managers who Richard had fired from Vanguard. She moved Nexus out of the basement and into a nondescript, industrial loft in Long Island City. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a war room. One wall was entirely glass, covered in sticky notes and schematics. The other wall was a digital map of the world, tracking shipping lanes in real time. Catherine, still going by Ann Miller, stood before the map. Her hair was still brown, pulled back in a severe bun. She wore turtlenecks and slacks, a stark contrast to the couture gowns of her past life. "Target number 1, Catherine announced to the senior team. She slapped a photo onto the whiteboard. It was a picture of a massive distribution center in Ohio. Red Mammoth Retail. Arthur Pendleton, the CEO, spun in his chair. "Anne, are you crazy? Red Mammoth is Vanguard's crown jewel. Richard has held that contract for 12 years. It accounts for 20% of his revenue. He'll nuke us if we get close." "He won't see us coming," Catherine said calmly. "I reviewed Richard's contract with Red Mammoth 5 years ago. It has a fuel surcharge clause. Richard charges them extra if oil goes above a certain price. But oil prices have dropped in the last 6 months, and I happen to know Richard hasn't adjusted the billing. He's overcharging them by approximately $3 million a quarter." The room went silent. "That's fraud," Arthur whispered. "It's aggressive accounting," Catherine corrected with a dark smile. "And it's our way in." Catherine didn't approach Red Mammoth directly. She knew their VP of logistics, a man named David Thorne. She knew David hated golf, but loved vintage motorcycles. Richard always took David golfing. Catherine sent Arthur to a vintage bike auction in Bold, instructed him to buy a 1,948 Indian Chief, and accidentally run into David Thorne. 2 weeks later, Nexus had a meeting with Red Mammoth. They didn't meet in a boardroom. They met in a diner in Jersey City, away from prying eyes. Catherine sat in the corner, wearing a baseball cap, coaching Arthur through an earpiece. "Show him the data, Arthur," she whispered. "Slide 4, the overcharge analysis." Arthur slid the tablet across the table to David Thorne. The VP looked at the numbers. His face went red, then purple. "Sterling has been ripping us off," Thorne hissed. "We can do it cheaper, faster, and transparently," Arthur said, repeating Catherine's words. "And we'll use dynamic routing to cut your delivery times by 20%. "You're a startup," Thorne scoffed. "If you fail, my supply chain collapses." "We have backing from Price Capital." Arthur dropped the bomb. Thorne's eyes widened. "Price is backing you? Switch 10% of your volume to us," Arthur said. "A pilot program. If we screw up, you lose nothing. If we succeed, you save $10 million a year." Thorne shook Arthur's hand. Back at Vanguard headquarters, the loss of 10% of the Red Mammoth account was treated as a clerical error. Richard was too busy dealing with the architects for his new summer home in the Hamptons to pay attention to a minor volume adjustment. "It's just a test run," Richard dismissed his CFO, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson. "They'll come crawling back when this startup fails. Who are they anyway? Nexus? Sounds like a shampoo brand." But they didn't come back. In 3 months, Nexus hit every metric perfectly. Their AI anticipated a dock strike in Los Angeles and rerouted Red Mammoth's goods to Seattle 3 days before the strike began. Vanguard's shipments sat rotting on the docks, while Nexus trucks were already on the highway. Red Mammoth moved 50% of their business to Nexus. Then came Blue Star Electronics. Then Global Foods. Catherine was surgical. She knew which clients Richard neglected. She knew which ones he insulted behind their backs. She systematically dismantled his client list, targeting the most profitable accounts first. Richard began to feel the heat. His quarterly earnings missed the target by 8%. The stock price of Vanguard dipped from $140 to $128. At home, the tension was palpable. Isabella was bored. She hadn't signed up for a stressed husband. She had signed up for a lifestyle. "Richard, you promised we'd go to Street Bart's for Christmas," she whined one evening, draping herself over the sofa. "Not now, Isabella," Richard roared, throwing his tablet onto the floor. "I'm bleeding cash. We've lost 3 major accounts in 6 months to this gnat of a company. So buy them," Isabella shrugged. "You always say everyone has a price." Richard narrowed his eyes. "You're right. I'll crush them with a buyout. I'll buy the company, strip it for parts, and fire everyone involved." He didn't know that the person he was planning to fire was the woman he had already discarded. The offer came in January. Vanguard Global offered to buy Nexus Logistics for $150 million. It was a staggering amount of money. For Arthur and the engineers, it was retire forever money. The office buzzed with excitement. "We have to take this, Anne," Arthur said, pacing the boardroom. $150 million. We've only been operating for 2 years. Catherine sat at the head of the table. She looked at the offer letter on the screen. It was signed by Richard Sterling. "No," she said. "No?" Arthur stopped pacing. "Anne, are you insane? This is the exit strategy." "This isn't the exit," Catherine said, her voice dropping an octave. "This is the bait. If we sell now, Richard buries our tech. He fires the staff. He goes back to his monopoly, and he wins. Do you want money, Arthur, or do you want to change the industry?" "I want the money," one of the junior developers shouted. Catherine stood up. She walked to the window. "Richard is offering $150 million because he's scared. He knows his Q4 numbers are going to be a disaster. He's trying to buy us to hide his losses. If we wait, if we push harder, we don't just get paid. We get everything." She turned to Arthur. "Reject the offer. Tell him the price is double." Arthur looked at her, terrified, but he trusted her. He sent the rejection. Richard's reaction was explosive. According to the gossip Catherine heard from her old contacts, Richard threw a crystal tumbler against the wall of his office, shattering a $50,000 piece of art. He decided to go to war. He lowered Vanguard's prices to unsustainable levels, selling at a loss just to starve Nexus out. He launched a smear campaign in the trade press, claiming Nexus's AI was unsecure and leaked customer data. It was a brutal winter. Nexus lost 2 clients. Morale plummeted. They were burning cash, fighting the PR war. Catherine worked 20-hour days. She slept on a cot in her office. She stopped dyeing her hair, letting the silver roots show, simply pulling it back tighter. She looked haggard, but her eyes burned with a terrifying intensity. She needed a knockout blow, and she found it in the Vector system, Richard's old logistics software. She knew that the Vector system had a leap year bug. It was a coding flaw from the early 2000s that Richard had been too cheap to fix. It had never mattered before, but this year was a leap year, and the flaw was scheduled to trigger on February 29th. Catherine met with Jonathan Price again. "He's undercutting us," Price said, tapping his fingers on the desk. "I'm losing patience, Catherine. My analysts say we should have sold." "Wait until March 1st, Catherine said. "Just wait." What happens on March 1st? The lights go out at Vanguard. February 29th arrived. It was a Thursday. At 8 a.m., the Vanguard global tracking system froze. Drivers in Germany couldn't access their routes. Ships in Singapore couldn't offload cargo because the digital manifests were corrupted. Warehouses in Texas went dark. It was global chaos. Richard was on CNBC Live when the news broke. The ticker at the bottom of the screen flashed. Vanguard system failure. Global supply chain halted. The anchor asked, "Mr. Sterling, reports are coming in that your entire network is down. What is happening?" Richard, sweating visibly under the studio lights, stammered, "It's a minor glitch. We are rebooting." It wasn't a minor glitch. The system was down for 48 hours. Billions of dollars in goods were stalled. Fresh produce rotted in containers. Auto factories shut down because they didn't get their parts. And there was Nexus, running smoothly. Catherine gave the order, call every Vanguard client. Now, tell them we are operational. Tell them we have capacity. The phones at Nexus didn't stop ringing for 3 days. It was a stampede. Desperate companies, furious at Vanguard, broke their contracts and switched to Nexus just to keep their businesses alive. In 1 week, Vanguard lost 40% of its market share. The stock price didn't just dip, it crashed. It plummeted to $45 a share. Richard was ruined. The board of directors was calling for his head. The banks were calling in his loans. And in the penthouse, Isabella was packing. "You're leaving?" Richard asked, sitting amidst the wreckage of his life. He was unshaven, wearing the same suit for 3 days. "You're broke, Richard," Isabella said, zipping up her Louis Vuitton bag, one he had paid for. "And honestly, you're kind of pathetic when you cry." She walked out, leaving him exactly how he had left Catherine, alone in a cold, expensive room. But Richard had one card left, a desperate Hail Mary pass. He called an emergency shareholder meeting. He was going to propose a merger with a European rival. It was a terrible deal, one that would destroy the company's legacy, but it would save his own skin and give him a golden parachute. He scheduled the vote for the annual Logistics Summit Gala in April. He needed to charm the shareholders one last time. Catherine saw the announcement. She called Jonathan Price. "It's time," she said. "Buy?" Price asked. "Buy everything," Catherine answered. "Start acquiring the voting shares. Do it through shell companies so he doesn't see it coming. By the night of the gala, I want us to own 51%. "And you?" Price asked. "Are you ready to come back from the dead?" Catherine looked at her reflection in the dark window of the office. "Yes, I need a dress." The Pierre Hotel ballroom was dripping with crystals and smelling of desperate money. This was the event of the season for the industrial elite. Richard Sterling stood at the podium. He looked thinner, older. The stress lines around his mouth were deep trenches, but he put on the show. He wore his tuxedo like armor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard boomed, his voice echoing, "Vanguard has faced challenges, but like the phoenix, we will rise. This merger with Eurotrans will secure our future." The crowd applauded politely, but the room was tense. Everyone knew the stock was in the toilet. Everyone knew Richard was fighting for his life. At the back of the room, the heavy double doors opened. The room went quiet, a ripple of silence spreading from the back to the front. A woman walked in. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her curves and trailed behind her like a royal train. Diamonds, real diamonds, loaned by Jonathan Price, glittered at her throat. Her hair was blonde again, styled in the same elegant wave she used to wear, but sharper, more modern. It was Catherine. But it wasn't the Catherine who left. This woman walked with the predatory grace of a panther. She was flanked by Jonathan Price on one side and Arthur Pendleton on the other. Richard stopped speaking mid-sentence. He squinted against the spotlight. He recognized the walk first, then the eyes. His microphone picked up his whisper. "Catherine?" She didn't stop. She walked straight through the center of the room, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. She walked right up to the stage. Security guards stepped forward, but Jonathan Price held up a hand. "She's with me, and I own the venue for the night." Catherine stopped at the foot of the stage. She looked up at Richard. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice wasn't amplified, but in the silent room, everyone heard it. "What are you doing here?" Richard hissed, leaning over the podium. "You weren't invited." "Security." "Actually," Catherine said, reaching into her clutch and pulling out a document. "I believe the majority shareholder is always invited." A gasp went through the room. "Majority shareholder?" Richard laughed nervously. "What are you talking about? You're destitute." "Am I?" Catherine smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "Jonathan, would you like to read the numbers?" Price stepped forward. As of 4 p.m. today, Nexus Logistics, backed by Price Capital, has acquired 52% of the outstanding voting shares of Vanguard Global. "We bought the debt, Richard, and we converted it to equity." Richard's face went white. He gripped the podium so hard, His knuckles turned yellow. That's impossible. That's a hostile takeover. It's just business, Catherine said, echoing the words he had said to her years ago. You can't do this, Richard stammered. I am the CEO. I built this. And you broke it, Catherine said. She climbed the stairs to the stage. The click of her heels was the only sound in the room. She stood next to him at the podium. She was taller than him in her heels. She took the microphone from his hand. He was too in shock to stop her. Ladies and gentlemen, Catherine addressed the stunned crowd. The merger with Eurotrans is cancelled. Murmurs of confusion and excitement broke out. My name is Catherine Sterling. Some of you know me as Richard's wife. Some of you know me as Ann Miller, the COO of Nexus. Shocked whispers. Ann Miller? The woman who stole the Red Mammoth account? I spent 15 years building this company from the shadows, Catherine continued, and I have spent the last 3 years building the company that beat it. Today, Nexus and Vanguard are one. We are merging the fleets. We are upgrading the tech. She turned to Richard. He looked small, shrunken, and as the new chairwoman of the board, Catherine said, her voice hard as steel, my first act of business is to address a redundancy in senior management. She pulled a folded envelope from her purse. It was identical to the one he had given her years ago. Richard Sterling, she said, you are relieved of your duties, effective immediately, for cause, gross negligence, fiduciary irresponsibility, and corporate malfeasance. Richard stared at the envelope. Catherine, please, don't do this here. Let's talk. We can work something out. I'm your husband. Ex-husband, she corrected. And we have nothing to talk about. The security team is waiting to escort you out. You can take your personal effects. Anything owned by the company stays. You can't kick me out, he whispered, tears forming in his eyes. I have nowhere to go. Isabella left me. The house is foreclosed. Catherine leaned in close, so only he could hear. It's 9 p.m., Richard. The hotels are open. She signaled the guards. The same guards who had escorted her out years ago stepped forward. They looked at Catherine with respect this time. Mr. Sterling, the head guard said. This way, sir. Richard was led off the stage, dragging his feet, humiliated in front of the entire industry he once ruled. Catherine watched him go. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel sadness. She felt a heavy, clean sense of balance restored. She turned back to the crowd, to the flashing cameras, and the stunned faces of the billionaires and senators. Now, Catherine said, smoothing her dress, does anyone have any questions about the Q3 logistics strategy? The room erupted in applause. The morning after the gala, the sun rose over Manhattan with a crisp, indifferent brightness. For Catherine Sterling, now the CEO of the newly merged Nexus Vanguard conglomerate, it was the first day of the rest of her life. She sat in Richard's old office. It felt different now. She had ordered the heavy, imposing mahogany furniture to be removed immediately. In its place stood sleek, modern glass desks and open collaborative spaces. She had the walls painted a soft, calming slate gray, covering the oppressive hunter green Richard had loved. But the real work wasn't redecorating. It was excavation. As Catherine and her team dug through the Vanguard servers, they found rot. Deep, systemic rot. Richard hadn't just been lazy. He had been reckless. There were hidden debts parked in Cayman Island shell companies, unpaid vendor invoices dating back years, and safety violations that had been swept under the rug with bribes. He was running a Ponzi scheme disguised as a shipping company, Arthur Pendleton said, tossing a stack of files onto Catherine's desk. He looked exhausted but exhilaratingly alive. If we hadn't taken over, this whole place would have imploded within 6 months. He would have gone to federal prison. He might still, Catherine said, sipping her black coffee, but that's not our concern. Our concern is the pension fund. Richard raided it to pay for his jet. We need to replenish it before the employees find out. That will cost us $30 million, Arthur warned. It'll wipe out our profits for the year. Do it, Catherine said without hesitation. We aren't Richard. We build. We don't steal. While Catherine was saving the livelihoods of 40,000 employees, Richard Sterling was waking up on a futon in a studio apartment in Weehawken, New Jersey. He had $200 in his checking account. The fall had been absolute. The golden parachute he had hoped for was denied by the board due to the gross cause clause Catherine had triggered. His stock options were worthless because they were tied to performance metrics he had falsified. The IRS was auditing him. Isabella had blocked his number. Even his friends, the men he played poker with, the senators he donated to, had ghosted him. In New York society, poverty is a contagious disease, and Richard was patient zero. He sat on the edge of the futon, staring at his reflection in a cracked mirror he'd bought at a garage sale. The face looking back was gray, unshaven, and terrified. "I am Richard Sterling," he whispered, trying to summon the old magic. "I am a titan of industry." But the room didn't answer. The radiator just hissed. He needed a job. He put on his one remaining suit, the one he had worn to the gala, now slightly wrinkled, and took the bus into the city. He walked into the offices of Global Logistics, a competitor he had once tried to bully. He demanded a meeting with the CEO, a man named Marcus Trend. "I can offer you insights into Vanguard's weaknesses," Richard pitched, sitting across from Marcus. "I know how Catherine thinks. She's emotional. She's weak. I can help you crush her." Marcus Trend looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Richard," Marcus said gently, "Catherine didn't beat you because she's emotional. She beat you because she's better than you. Her Q1 numbers are out. She's up 20%. Employee retention is at an all-time high. She fixed the supply chain mess you created." "She got lucky," Richard snapped. "She had Price's money." "She had vision," Marcus corrected, standing up. "We aren't hiring, Richard. And frankly, even if we were, you're uninsurable. You're a liability. Please leave before I call security." Richard walked out onto 6th Avenue. It started to rain again. It seemed it was always raining in his new life. He walked past a newsstand. The Wall Street Journal featured a picture of Catherine. She was wearing a hard hat, shaking hands with dockworkers in Baltimore. The headline read, "The People's CEO, How Catherine Sterling Saved American Shipping." Richard felt a bile rise in his throat. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear the paper apart, but he didn't have the dollar to buy it. The months dragged on. Richard's savings evaporated. He sold his watch. He sold his cufflinks. He eventually sold the custom Italian shoes off his feet to a consignment store for $50. He applied for mid-level management jobs. Rejected. He applied for consulting gigs. Rejected. He applied for a job as a floor manager at a warehouse. The hiring manager, a woman in her 30s, looked at his resume and laughed. Overqualified and underskilled. Next. By November, exactly 1 year after he had kicked Catherine out, Richard Sterling was destitute. He was facing eviction from the Weehawken studio. He had hit the bottom, but unlike Catherine, he had no resilience to bounce back. He had no shadow ledger. He had no hidden skills. He had only his arrogance, which was now a heavy stone around his neck. He needed money fast. He saw an ad on a lamppost. Drivers wanted. Immediate hire. Cash tips. It was a rideshare and delivery app. No resume required. Just a clean driving record. Richard swallowed his pride. It tasted like ash. He leased a dented Toyota Corolla and signed up. The wind that whipped down 57th Street on Christmas Eve was not merely cold. It was malicious. It was the kind of wind that found the gaps in cheap coats and settled into the marrow of the bone. New York City, in its indifferent majesty, had dressed itself in diamonds and grime. For the tourists in Rockefeller Center, the city was a wonderland of pine and golden lights. For the forgotten, it was a canyon of ice. Inside the penthouse, at 432 Park Avenue, however, the world was soft, warm, and scented with cinnamon and expensive red wine. Catherine Sterling stood by the window, the same window where she had stood years ago when Richard shattered her life. But the reflection staring back at her tonight was different. The fear was gone. The frantic need to please was gone. In its place was a woman who stood with her weight evenly distributed, holding a glass of vintage Bordeaux with a steady hand. She had bought the penthouse back 3 months ago. It was a controversial decision. Arthur had argued against it, calling it a mausoleum of bad memories, but Catherine needed to do it. She needed to overwrite the code of her past. She had stripped the walls of Richard's dark, brooding art and replaced them with vibrant, abstract pieces. She had burned the heavy velvet drapes and installed sheer linen that let the light breathe. She had turned a house of oppression into a home of triumph. "You're brooding again," a voice called out. Catherine turned. Jonathan Price was sitting in a sprawling cream armchair, wearing a ridiculous reindeer sweater that looked jarringly out of place on a corporate shark. "Not brooding," Catherine smiled, walking back to the fire. "Just remembering. It feels like a different lifetime." "It was," Arthur Pendleton chimed in. He was sitting on the rug, trying to assemble a complex Lego set he had bought for his nephew, but clearly enjoying it himself. "In that lifetime, you were a passenger. Now you're the pilot. Speaking of which, did we ever sort out dessert? I feel like a celebration isn't a celebration without sugar." "I ordered the pear tart from Le Bernardin," Catherine said, checking her phone. "It's their signature. The courier should be here any minute." 70 floors below, in a world that felt light years away, a rusted 2014 Toyota Corolla idled in the delivery lane. The heater was broken, blowing only lukewarm, dusty air that smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. Richard Sterling rubbed his hands together, trying to generate friction. His knuckles were raw and chapped, the skin cracking in the dry winter air. He wore fingerless gloves because they made it easier to handle the phone, but tonight, his fingertips were numb. His phone mounted on the dashboard let out a sharp, demanding ping. "New order. Priority pickup from Le Bernardin. Destination: 432 Park Avenue. Payout: $58 plus customer tip." Richard stared at the screen. The blue light illuminated the hollows of his cheeks and the gray stubble on his chin. 432 Park Avenue. His breath hitched in his throat. He knew that address better than he knew the lines of his own face. He knew the code to the service gate, 1984. He knew that the lobby smelled of white tea and polished brass. He knew that the elevator rose at a rate of 1,000 feet per minute. He should decline. His thumb hovered over the red X. He could not go back there. Not like this. Not as a servant in the kingdom he once ruled. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. But then, his eyes drifted to the fuel gauge. It was hovering just above empty. He had $12 in his bank account until the weekly payout cleared on Tuesday. If he didn't take this job, he wouldn't eat tomorrow. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat and tapped, "Accept." "God help me," he whispered to the dashboard. The drive was a torture chamber of nostalgia. He passed the jewelry store where he had bought Catherine her anniversary diamonds he later found out she had pawned to survive. He passed the steakhouse where he used to hold court with senators, buying $5,000 bottles of wine without blinking. Now he was invisible. He was just traffic. He picked up the white bakery box from Le Bernardin. The hostess, a young woman in a sleek black dress, didn't look him in the eye. She just shoved the box across the counter. "Careful with it," she snapped. "It's for a VIP. I used to be a VIP," Richard wanted to scream. "I used to own this city." Instead, he mumbled, "Yes, ma'am," and ducked his head. When he arrived at 432 Park, the humiliation deepened. The main doorman, a stalwart named Henry, who had worked there for 20 years, was still on duty. Richard pulled his wool hat down low, hiding his face. He prayed Henry wouldn't recognize the shambling figure in the oversized parka as the former master of the universe, who used to tip him in hundreds. "Service entrance around the back," Henry said dismissively, waving him away. "And wipe your feet, don't track slush into my lobby." Richard nodded, keeping his eyes on the pavement. He walked to the service elevator, the slow, metal box that smelled of garbage bags and lemon cleaner. He used to forbid Catherine from using this elevator. "It's for the help," he had told her. The irony tasted like copper in his mouth. He pressed the button for the penthouse. The elevator groaned and began its ascent. 10, 20, 30. His heart hammered against his ribs. Who lived there now? A Saudi prince? A tech billionaire? Whoever it was, they were living his life. They were looking out of his windows. The elevator dinged at the penthouse level. The doors slid open. Richard stepped into the service vestibule. He walked to the heavy oak door. He raised a trembling hand to knock. But then he stopped. He heard laughter. It was a rich, full laugh. A laugh he hadn't heard in years. Catherine? No, it couldn't be. She was in Jersey. She was destitute. He had made sure of it. Or had she? He remembered the headlines, the takeover. The blur of his downfall was so chaotic, he had blocked most of the details out. But he knew she had won. He just didn't realize she had reclaimed the throne. He wanted to turn around. He wanted to leave the box on the mat and run. But his feet were lead. He was paralyzed by a morbid, masochistic curiosity. He rang the bell. Inside, the chime echoed softly. "I'll get it," Catherine called out. She set her wineglass down on the marble island. "Arthur, don't let Jonathan eat the garnishes." She walked to the door, her cashmere sweater soft against her skin, her mind completely at ease. She expected a faceless courier. She expected a transaction. She opened the door. The hallway light was bright, unforgiving. It cast harsh shadows on the man standing there. For 3 seconds, there was no sound in the universe. Catherine stared. The man was stooped. His parka was stained with grease. He wore cheap, oversized cargo pants and boots that were worn down at the heels, but the eyes, pale, watery, and terrified, were unmistakable. Richard? The name escaped her lips before she could stop it. It wasn't spoken with malice. It wasn't spoken with anger. It was spoken with pure, unadulterated shock. Richard flinched, as if she had struck him. He looked at her. He took in the glow of her skin, the way she stood tall and unafraid, the warmth of the apartment behind her. He saw the Christmas tree sparkling in the corner, the spot where he used to put his golf clubs. He saw the life he had thrown away. Richard's voice cracked. It was a rusty, unused thing. He cleared his throat, trying to salvage a shred of dignity, but there was none left to find. "I have a delivery for Miss Sterling." He held out the white box. His hands were shaking so violently that the string on the box vibrated. Catherine looked at the box, then back at his face. She saw the lines of exhaustion etched into his skin. She saw the hunger. She realized, with a sudden jolt of clarity, that the war was truly over. There was no enemy left to fight. There was only this broken man, freezing in her doorway on Christmas Eve. She didn't feel the surge of triumph she had expected. She didn't feel the urge to gloat. She just felt a profound, quiet sadness for the waste of it all. She reached out and took the box. Her fingers brushed his glove's cheap synthetic wool against her manicured skin. "Thank you," she said softly. Richard couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, at the Italian marble he had once paid $200 a square foot to install. "Enjoy the tart," he whispered. It's pear." He turned to go. He needed to escape. He needed to be back in the darkness of the elevator. "Wait," Catherine said. Richard froze. His back stiffened. Was she going to yell at him? Was she going to laugh? Catherine reached into the pocket of her jeans. She didn't carry cash often, but she had kept a crisp $100 bill for the courier, it being a holiday. She stepped forward and extended the bill. "Richard," she said. He turned slowly. He looked at the money. $100. It was more than he had made in the last 3 days combined. It was a tank of gas. It was groceries for a week. It was also the ultimate surrender. If he took it, he was admitting he was no longer her equal, no longer her husband, no longer a man of power. He was the help. He looked at Catherine. Her eyes were not mocking. They were kind, and that kindness hurt more than any cruelty ever could. "Take it," she said, her voice gentle. "It's Christmas." Richard's hand came up slowly, fighting gravity. His fingers closed around the bill. The paper was crisp and sharp. "Thank you," he choked out. The tears were close now, burning the backs of his eyes. "Merry Christmas, Richard," Catherine said. She didn't step back. She held her ground, a queen in her castle. "Merry Christmas, Catherine." He turned and stabbed the elevator button. The doors opened immediately, as if the building itself wanted to expel him. He stepped inside. As the doors began to slide shut, he looked up one last time. Catherine was still standing there, framed by the golden light of the penthouse. She wasn't watching him with hate. She was watching him with the distant, pitying gaze one gives to a stranger who has lost their way. The doors clicked shut. The golden light was severed. Richard was alone in the metal box. He rode the elevator down to the basement. He walked past the garbage bins. He walked out into the biting wind of the alley. He climbed into his Corolla. The engine sputtered before turning on. He sat there for a long time, the engine idling. He looked at the $100 bill in his hand. He crumbled it in his fist, tight, until his knuckles turned white. Then, he pressed it against his forehead and wept. He cried for the money, he cried for the cold, and he cried because he finally understood the true cost of everything he had done. 70 floors up, Catherine locked the door. She took a deep breath, exhaling the ghost of the past. "Who was it?" Arthur called out from the living room, pouring more wine. "Did the tart arrive intact?" Catherine walked back into the warmth. She placed the box on the counter and untied the string. "Yes," Catherine said, her voice steady and clear. "It was just the delivery man. He was just someone passing through." She picked up her wine glass and rejoined her friends. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, burying the city, covering the tracks of the Toyota Corolla, and washing the streets clean for the morning. And that is the story of Catherine and Richard. It's a brutal reminder that the wheel of fortune is always turning. Richard thought his power made him invincible, but he forgot the most important rule of life. Be careful who you step on during your way up, because they are exactly the people you will meet on your way down. Catherine didn't just win because she was smart. She won because she kept her dignity when she had nothing else. She turned her pain into fuel, while Richard let his ego become his cage. What would you have done if you were Catherine? Would you have given Richard that tip, or would you have slammed the door in his face? I really want to know what you think. Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. We have a crazy one coming up next week about a lottery winner who hid his ticket from his greedy family. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and stay strong.
So I think that was the last time that I was in this area. Also, I did made a video of that. If you haven't seen that, you can definitely check it out on my channel. the skyline a little better? Once it gets a little